Hello and welcome to another episode of the SEO Unplugged podcast. I'm your host, Itamar Blauer. Today I'm joined with Naomi Francis-Parker, who's the SEO manager at Deliveroo. Naomi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, all good, thank you. Good to see you and always great to catch up. And for this episode, a really interesting topic and something that I think is almost not talked about enough, which is UX driven SEO and how we can really combine UX with SEO to provide not only just a very strong experience for users on the website, but also how the two elements can really complement each other when working through a digital strategy. So, probably, well, a lot of what I want to sort of cover may draw upon your experience working for different types of brands. Obviously, you're at Deliveroo at the point of this recording. So, in your sort of words, how would you sort of describe the, I guess, the necessity almost of considering UX as part of an SEO strategy, and where do you sort of feel that a lot of SEO people might not necessarily put as much of an importance on UX?
It's a good question, and I agree that I don't think it's thought about in the way that it should be. My view on SEO as a whole is that it should always be holistic and it underpins everything that nearly every marketing department does. So that the UX is almost just like baked into it. If you think about what user experience actually is, it's the experience of the user, their perception of your brand, their perception of your website, their physical experience on your website, their physical experience when they do a search for, say, search for your brand or non-branded, whether you appear, all of that is experiential, if that's a word. And so it doesn't matter whether you're technically optimizing a page or if you're doing, even things like digital PR, getting links, all that kind of stuff, all of it feeds into the user experience. And so I think that they're almost like one and the same, to be completely honest. And I think as SEOs or as marketers in general, UX should always feed into anything, literally anything that you do.
Sure. And so, with that, then, how is somebody meant to sort of almost begin thinking about the UX aspects? Because I assume you have to first understand where you're currently sat, but what's the best way for a business to really get to start to understand where it's at from a UX perspective and what sort of first steps that they should take?
So I think if you're doing a strategy, which I imagine you would be doing, whether that's an SEO strategy, marketing strategy, but let's speak specifically about SEO. If I'm doing a strategy, the first thing that I do, if I'm new to a brand or if I'm just doing a refresh, is I like to understand everything on the website. So all the pages that exist on the website, and then all your classic SEO stuff like mapping those pages, etc. But then the metrics that you're looking at, as well as your classic like traffic, revenue, things like that, you also want to actually look at more user, I wouldn't say necessarily the user experience metrics, but metrics that reflect user behavior on the page. So your conversion rate, your bounce rate, engagement rate, all of that kind of stuff. You want to be taking that into account when you're looking at how your website's actually working. And then before you realize it, you'll already be looking at the user experience side of things. So for example, you have a really high traffic bunch of pages or page and you want to optimize it and you want to do all the classic stuff and you've done all the SEO stuff, let's just say, but your bounce rate is rubbish. People aren't doing the page and they're leaving immediately. Or if it's like a commercial page, money page, if the conversion rate is really low, but if you're looking at your like SEO checkbox, let's say, everything's on there, there's a reason there that is more closely tied to the user experience and the whole experience of the page, which is causing that friction. And it's identifying that friction, which before you realize it, you're actually already looking at the user experience side of things, because it might be like down to colors on the page. It could be that the button that you need them to click isn't very readable, or it's really small, or it's positioned in a really weird part of the page. All of that is user experience. So you've got your strategy, you've got your metrics that you typically look at from an SEO perspective, but to start getting into the mindset of the behavior and the experience, you want to look at those more user experience related metrics like conversion rate, etc.
Okay, sure. And what would you say the best ways to really analyze those types of metrics would be? I assume that most people, let's say, have Google Analytics installed as a way to sort of take a look at a bunch of different types of metrics on how their site is performing. But in terms of UX, particular things to look at. So, say for example, the point that you mentioned is quite interesting. Of like, well, maybe your CTAs are too small, or maybe the color scheme isn't that great. How are you meant to analyze that? Are there any tools, let's say, other than Google Analytics that you've used, or people, or you recommend that people use as a way to try and sort of get a deeper analysis on a website?
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, it's important to mention that it depends on the setup of your company or agency. So some companies will have like a crow analyst, conversion optimization. They might have their own UX team. So when I was working at Charlotte Tilbury, we had a whole UX team. So I would also speak to them to see what data they had. But sometimes businesses don't have any of that. So it really depends where you are. But I would say I would encourage everybody to see what teams exist, first of all, and actually speak to those teams, because you don't have to like suffer in silence. They might have a bunch of information that might actually match up with, say, for example, you're like, oh, the bounce rate on these pages is really low. I can't figure out what it is. There might be a team that already has that data, or has data that you can then match up with that. So I would make that first point. The second thing I would say is I would encourage everyone to have heat mapping on their website. Heat mapping is a super, super useful tool. And the one that I am a big fan of is Crazy Egg. And it literally just tracks users on your website, and it's all anonymous data, but you can see where pain points are, and you can track really specific pages to see how people that are physically using those pages, what they're clicking on, how far they're scrolling as well. I would also encourage people to start tracking like scroll depth, because you might think, even if something's at the bottom of the page, which you all know isn't the best thing to do, but you might put something important halfway down the page with the assumption that most people are going there because maybe you go there all the time, or people in the company go there all the time. You have a look at the scroll depth tracking, and no one's scrolling at all. So then they're missing the key pieces of information. So definitely Google Analytics for your key metrics like scroll depth and bounce rate and all that kind of stuff. But heat mapping is another really, really, really useful tool for that.
Awesome. And let's say we've got to the point where, let's say we've got heat mapping in place, we've got the general sort of analytics set up so we understand our metrics. How would you go about experimenting with A/B testing and really trying to get to the sort of core of how you can improve UX on a page? And if we maybe specifically focus on commercial type pages. So let's say if you're a B2C, it might be a product page. So if we, and I assume obviously, well, if you're on the B2B front, it might be a service page. But how would you then go about doing these A/B tests? What do you sort of typically look to try and test? And what are your sort of go-tos from that perspective?
So the majority of the time, if we've got all that information, I'm like, right, cool, we want to make these updates. Before you make any updates, make it super clear to yourself, but also the other teams that will need to be involved. I tend to find that it's a lot easier to implement, and it's a lot easier to work on A/B testing if you have an engineer or developer, or if you're lucky enough to have like a UX team or whoever it might be involved. Make sure it's super clear what metrics you actually are looking to improve, because it can depend on what it is that you're changing. So, for example, you might have your bounce rate might be fine, but your conversion rate might be really low on a page. So, if you're wanting to isolate those first so that it's really controlled, and you can either A/B test, but I've also just made improvements where it's like a no-brainer. You know something's going to work, but you still need to measure it, obviously, to prove the use case. So in those instances, still definitely think it's worth it, but make sure you have data for, let's say, like 3 to 6 months prior to the change. Make sure you've got all your metrics mapped, and then you want to monitor the same change for the same time period afterwards and compare the two. Because I think that in SEO, not a lot of SEOs, but some SEOs struggle with A/B testing. It depends on your CMS, depends on all the various things that are involved. And so then it can be like, well, how are we going to prove the return on investment, which is a classic SEO issue. So by doing it that way and just making sure everything is mapped and being super clear and super strict on your metrics, your KPIs, and what the outcome is going to be, mapping it before and after, that's a really nice way for you to be able to say, 6 months ago, or for the last 6 months, we were achieving X conversion rate, let's say, and for the following 6 months, we made this change and we achieved Y. And for seasonal businesses, where it's not going to be as simple as, say you're coming out of Christmas and you're an e-commerce business and you go into like Q1, like the depths of when no one wants to buy anything, it's not going to be comparable. So I would also urge patience where you need to test based on seasonality and you don't have like an A/B situation going on. But as long as you can justify that and your company will know that you're seasonal, I think it's worth it. And I've done that in the past and it's worked really well. But I would urge patience as well in those instances where it's super, super seasonal.
Yeah, some really good points there. And I think when it comes to any sort of changes that require, development work, whether you've got a team or you're doing it yourself, a lot of companies aren't, fortunate enough to have UX teams. And I guess with that, it's also then a question of, how do we make sure that everyone's on board and also that things are deployed as you've intended. So with that, are there some sort of key types of challenges or things to be aware of for people who want to start doing maybe some A/B testing and UX improvements that they sort of need to know before they just jump in, just to make sure that nothing goes wrong? I know it's a very abstract way of thinking about it, but are there some key challenges or things that people should look out for?
Yeah, definitely. I would say for sure, make sure that developers, engineers, whoever's going to be deploying, working on these changes, are crystal clear on exactly what they need to do and also the outcome that you want to achieve. You kind of take a product mindset. So depending on what company you're in, SEO can sit in performance marketing, but it can also sit as part of product. And I find the product mindset is a lot more straightforward and aligned to what we try to achieve in SEO, especially with like technical changes, because you have to really, you're working with engineers, you're working with developers, and for example, at Deliveroo, have to make these docs that lay every single thing out that I possibly want to achieve, what the use case is, what the experience is going to be for the consumer, what the experience is going to be for a search engine as well, because it's SEO driven, making sure that the engineers and developers involved are clear on all of those steps. And then in situations where engineers may not be might not be SEO experts, if there's specific code, if there's something you really want to implement that you know how it needs to be implemented, but you can't do the implementation because you're not a developer, come up with templates and walk through it with them so that they're crystal clear. Because then once everyone's aligned on the same page, and it might be a lot of work to put all of that together, but it's worth it because then you know that when they go and deploy it, there aren't going to be any issues, there won't be any gaps, and you're all working off the same, you're all singing off the same hymn sheet, essentially. So templates are your best friend, and also just taking the time to explain to engineers or developers what you're trying to achieve, and also appreciating that they're not SEO experts. I think if you, especially if you're quite a technical SEO, you can make the mistake of thinking that, wow, developers work on websites, so they're also going to be technical, but it is actually two completely different things. So having the patience there as well.
Yeah, some really good points, and I can definitely relate to some of those. That's assumptions that I've had in the past, and then you sort of realize actually not everyone sort of understand understands things maybe in the same way that we do as SEO people, which is really valid. The next thing I wanted to touch upon as well is with UX and a lot, sort of how a lot of things have become more mobile first. Do you find that having UX changes or UX driven SEO is more impactful when it comes to, let's say, mobile displays or how websites and pages load on mobile versus desktop? Or do you think that the sort of outputs or the benefits are pretty much the same across all types of devices? Because obviously, sort of, we mentioned doing the heat mapping, and I'd imagine that, let's say you do heat mapping for a product page, if you're an ecom, most likely you might want to focus on a product page for a mobile layout, because you would assume that most people are going to be, purchasing from their phones. Do you find though that from a UX perspective, you tend to find more impacts and better results on certain types of devices, or does it help across the board?
I think definitely devices plays a huge role, mainly mobile, because a lot of the times when pages are designed, and also depending on what kind of website you work on, how pages are designed for desktop, if you've got a responsive site, you can kind of just assume that, oh, it's responsive, so it's fine. But for example, if you have, say you have like a gridded format for, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. Like, so at Deliveroo, we have like these cuisine pages, which have cuisines on them, obviously. And they're really functional. You put your address in. I'm sure most people have used our website or similar. And then it takes you to the restaurant page. But before that, if you want to see the different cuisines that we have with a gridded format, and I've worked on other sites that have a gridded format, and with things like grids or cards or anything like that, they look lovely on desktop. And if you've got a responsive site, you could assume like, oh, it's fine, that will just shrink it down. But then you go on mobile and you're scrolling for ages, because like 4 cards on a desktop, easy, it fits on one page. 4 cards, especially big cards on a mobile, they're going to be sat there scrolling for ages and they're probably going to leave. So I would definitely say that devices make a big difference. And when you mentioned heat mapping, when you're looking at heat mapping, most of the tools you can choose whether you want to have a look at the desktop, tablet, mobile, or all of them. I would look at, if you want to optimize the whole site, look at the usage, like the device usage for page types. So like you say, a product page, probably going to be mostly mobile because people are just buying and that's just the way it is. But for example, if you've got a whole discovery part of your website, like a blog or something like that, you may find that the ratio between desktop and mobile might be a bit more even. You could be surprised and find that more people are on desktop. So you might want to skew your optimization towards them. I think a lot of people assume it's all mobile, and it is most of the time, but sometimes it's not. So just double check. Yeah.
For sure. No, really, really good stuff there. And something that I want to sort of end the conversation on, and another sort of abstract way of thinking about it, is from the search engine's perspective. And obviously, we've got, AI platforms into the mix as well. When it comes to businesses like Google, who have always sort of said that their whole model is about making life better for the user, focusing on the user experience. And when you sort of factor how much of an emphasis companies like Google have placed around UX and providing a strong UX, how do you sort of see then the UX approach on websites and how that's going to adapt over time as we've entered this AI era and this space? Where do you sort of see UX going in terms of the importance of it and how it can also then still factor in within an SEO strategy?
I think it's going to be really interesting. First of all, I think there are two sides, almost like the practical side and actually just how LLMs are shaping the way that we think about surfacing products or services. I think from like the psychological side, I'm obviously not a psychologist, but just from what I've observed, people are a lot more, and they have been for a while, but they're a lot more, they like to look at many different um, search engines, social media, all of that before they search for something or make a decision. And so, actually, this goes back to my first point of user experience being the entire experience of everything. Um, how you're surfacing and how you're appearing and how your products are being mentioned on all of these different touch points is almost just as important, potentially even more important than the experience on your website. And I think companies need to be aware of that. So your website could be great and have great user experience, but if you think of the point of SEO, it's getting people to that bit in the first place. So I'd say that's like the psychological side of it. It reminds me of Now, this story, I've heard this story and it is true, but I don't know like the exact ins and outs. But basically, Apple, the way that they designed the where in fact the thing that got me into user experience is actually this story around Apple and how they design their packaging, because the user experience for them goes beyond just getting your Mac out and be like, oh, cool, yeah, here's my Mac. It's like every single touch point beyond that, before that. So when you go into the store, you have that experience. And this is true for everything. The box that you get, it looks nice, it feels nice, the way you like, and this is very ASMR, but like the way that you know, remove the packaging, all of that feeds into the experience. And it, of course, makes you way more excited for the actual product. It's almost more important than the product. We've all had like deliveries from delivery companies where it's like chucked in a plastic bag and it's fine, but it doesn't add to the whole kind of vibe of it. And I think that's how psychologically LLMs are kind of, and social media as well, actually, things like TikTok, all that kind of stuff is shaping the way that we're wanting to experience internet products like websites. And the practical side, I don't have an answer for that yet because I think we don't really know. But I will say that user experience, I think, goes beyond the user, like the human beings. And I think actually, especially as AI develops, we may need to start thinking about the experience of like agents. Because if we're going to start, which I'm sure we will at some point, having agents buy things for us, their experience on the website is going to shape how or whether they choose our website. Because I've got no doubt that in however many years, they'll be able to choose the website for us. And what are they going to base that choice on? Is probably going to be an experience in a different kind of way. That's a very abstract, wild thought, but I'm sure we'll get there probably.
No, I absolutely love that. I think, yeah, so moving from UX to AX, the
Yeah.
agent experience, that's well, you heard it here first. That's all I'm gonna say about that. But no, this has been a really, really fascinating discussion around sort of UX driven SEO and how SEOs can really think more about improving that overall experience for their users, but also as we're sort of discussing now about agents as well and how AI sort of plays into this whole sphere as well. So, Naomi, where can people find you if they want to ask any questions or want to learn a bit more about the cool stuff that you're doing at Deliveroo?
LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can find me, follow me, connect with me, message me. Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, it's been great to have you on the show, Naomi. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everyone listening out there as well. And as always, we will see you in the next episode.